Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, the editors of James Buchanan and the Coming of the Civil War, John Quist and Michael Birkner.
Our guests are John Quist and Michael Birkner, and they are the editors of this book, James Buchanan and the Coming of the Civil War. John Quist, for someone watching this who knows almost nothing about James Buchanan, what should they know?
Well, he was the 15th President of the United States. He was essentially the President of the United States when the Civil War began. Secession occurred during the last few months of his presidency. He's also the only president from Pennsylvania.
Michael Birkner, you want to add anything?
Well, obviously, as an extension of that, he was our only bachelor president. He was a person who served his country in many different capacities and probably would not have become president if he hadn't basically worked well and effectively in the various roles he took on for a number of presidents, including Minister to England, Secretary of State, served in the House, served in the Senate. So he really had quite a resume, and that needs to be factored in.
Elected in 1856. What was the 1856 election like? What was going on in the country at the time?
Well, 1856 election, there were three candidates for the presidency. Buchanan received the Democratic nomination. The new Republican Party nominated John C. Fremont, and the Whigs and Know-Nothings nominated former President Millard Fillmore. It was nationally a three-way race, but it was a two-way race in the north between Buchanan and Fremont, a two-way race in the south between Fillmore and Buchanan. And Buchanan won the election by winning almost every southern states and a smattering of northern states.
Yeah, I'd add to that if you need to know something about 56, aside from what John said, it was a time of great intensity in the country, probably much more so than in the previous several elections, because a number of Southerners, the so-called fire eaters, said that if a sectional candidate like Fremont was elected, they'd secede. Now, how serious they were and how much support they had is debatable, but it was a concern. And Buchanan portrayed himself as the candidate who would quell a sectional agitation, who was a national candidate as opposed to Fremont. And that, of course, helped get him over the finish line.
It says in the book that he was a conservative within his party. What did that mean at the time to be a conservative within the Democratic Party?
Well, I was going to start by saying that there are really two different angles you can play on this. One is a conservative in terms of strict construction of the Constitution, right? And then there's the issue which overlaps that, which is conservative on issues of slavery. And so there are a number of Democrats in the North who are popular sovereignty Democrats, and there are a number of Democrats in the North who simply want to move away from the slavery issue entirely. Buchanan tended to be conservative in that he wanted the slavery issue to be on the back burner. He would come up with different ideas about how to deal with it, one of which was to just draw the line of the Missouri Compromise all the way to the Pacific, and let's be done with it. Let slavery be okay below that line, and let's not have slavery above it. But I think that in general he was a conservative, and in terms of the slavery issue, he was considered a doughface, a northern man with southern principles.
And he had his political base ultimately, while president, was not Pennsylvania, it was really the states of the South, the slaveholding states. And he aimed to keep that wing of the party pleased with him. He wasn't always successful in keeping Southerners happy, but he was even less successful in keeping Northerners happy.
The issue, of course, was how much of this was pragmatic and how much of this is his temperament and his outlook. John's exactly right that that's where his emphasis was, on making sure the South was satisfied, at least until the very end of his presidency. But it was because he was a person who had most of his friends from the South, including William R. King, who was probably his closest compatriot in the Senate, who was from Alabama. He was a person who was comfortable with Southerners in the messes that he lived in Washington, D.C., comfortable with their point of view, and he sort of imbibed a very genial notion, a polite fiction about what slavery was all about, if you will, on the basis of his intercourse with these people. He was not really realistic about what slavery was.
But before we go too far, I'll probably be reading snippets from this book, but can you explain what this book is? Because if I read quotes out of the book, it's not necessarily your words.
No, it's not. The book is a collection of essays based on the work of a number of historians. In 2008, Michael and I worked together with some people of Lancaster to put together a symposium which brought together a number of historians from across the country to discuss James Buchanan and the politics of the 1850s. And so we took the essays from that symposium, had the authors revise them, edited them, and put them in this book.
Did you find historians in your group who were Buchanan supporters or defenders?
That's a good question. I think that I'd put it this way, that there were people who, when they looked at Buchanan, did not fall into the trap of simple scorn for him. They said, there's got to be something else here. And several of the scholars who wrote for this book offered perspectives on Buchanan that if they don't raise him out of the basement among presidents, they make us look at him in a somewhat more nuanced way and notice that he did some things well as president. That tends to get obscured when we focus on, Dred Scott and Kansas and secession.
And there's a variety of viewpoints in the book regarding Buchanan. With a number of the contributors viewing him not very sympathetically at all, and others not quite viewing him sympathetically yet, nonetheless, as Michael said, viewing him with some nuance. What
did he do well?
Well, he seems to have nipped the African slave trade effectively. It had been revived because slave trading was very profitable, and you would not expect somebody who was a doughface to actually enforce the law as vigorously as Buchanan did it, but he did. Similarly, there were these adventurers who went into Latin America, stirring up trouble and perhaps trying to annex, if you will, a slave society into connections with the United States. And these filibusters, as they were known, were really not Buchanan's friends. He made sure that they were brought to justice. You wouldn't expect that about Buchanan, but John Bell-Lavec and some other scholars have shown that he did a very good job on that front.
Another thing one of our contributors says that Buchanan did well was to remove Brigham Young as governor from Utah Territory. Brigham Young had been governor of Utah for 10 years, since the Mormon settlement of Utah in 1847, and he had been appointed and reappointed territorial governor. Franklin Pierce had tried to remove Brigham Young and couldn't find anybody to take the job. James Buchanan did remove Brigham Young, and William McKinnon gives Buchanan credit for removing Young as governor. At the same time, he says that a lot of the problems that Buchanan had throughout his presidency were exhibited during the so-called Utah expedition, or Utah War as it's called, because a number of people that Buchanan appointed to carry out that mission of removing Young were not very effective leaders. He also sent about a third of the United States Army to Utah to remove Young, and it ended up being a very large, very expensive affair that might have been managed better.
He sent a third of the army to Utah to remove Brigham Young as governor?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
The army was much smaller than maybe.
Yeah, we're talking about an army of
Yeah.
7,500 people,
Yeah.
but it would be added onto by local volunteers, which was part of the complexity and perhaps the problem here. One of the things about the Utah story, to elaborate on John's point, is that McKinnon's article, which we think is a very fine contribution to this book, really shows the value of getting into the sources and looking closely at things, because it isn't one way. Just as John said, Buchanan deserves credit for removing Young, who deserved to be removed. But Buchanan forgot to tell Young that he was being removed, and he forgot to do a number of other things, including he neglected to tell the armed forces that he was sending that he had canceled the postal contracts out west, which means that he had cut off communications with them accidentally by canceling these contracts and the Army not being able to communicate back with him. He was an impetuous character, and that's one of the things that runs against the grain of what normally we think of when we think of Buchanan, because the classic view of Buchanan was that he was timid and weak and vacillating, whereas I think our book tends to show from the collection of essays that he was a much more impetuous and stubborn person on most occasions than he was weak and vacillating. He wasn't weak or vacillating in Utah. He wasn't weak or vacillating in Kansas. I think the moniker tends to stick more on the secession crisis, but even there are complexities.
Yeah, as one of our contributors says, Buchanan at times exhibited errant decisiveness.
It's a good phrase.
Yeah.
What was the Mountain Meadows Massacre, part of the Utah?
Well, there in the midst of this large expedition of the United States Army on its way to Utah, and again, as Michael said, the Buchanan had not really informed Brigham Young that he was going to be relieved as governor. So Mormons, thinking that this was another chapter in the by then long history of persecution, were prepared for the worst. And in what was in Utah rather practically a warlike situation, a train of immigrants on its way from Missouri and Arkansas to Southern California was massacred by settlers in southern Utah on September 11th of all days, 1857. With about 120, 123 men, women, and children, say over the age of 4, all killed by a band of Mormon settlers.
It says in the article by William McKinnon in your book, so ruinous was Buchanan's financial management and so substantial was the Utah War's negative impact on the nation's financial condition that once the Civil War began, conspiracists argued that proto-Confederates in Buchanan's cabinet had deliberately launched the Utah expedition to undermine the U.S. government's financial ability to combat secession. Think they were thinking that far in advance?
Well, I think that fits with most conspiracy theorists, it's a little beyond the pale. Buchanan wasn't thinking along those lines, and neither were the so-called neo-Confederates or proto-Confederates in his cabinet.
Who were really Union men in the 1850s.
Right. Yeah. I mean, did Buchanan bungle finances? Yes, I think that would be a fair statement. But that's a far stretch, I think, from suggesting that he was trying to cripple the government. We know enough about Buchanan's behavior during the secession crisis to know that he did his job. He executed the role of the President of the United States according to his oath.
Jacob Thompson, Secretary of the Interior, John Floyd, Secretary of Defense, Howell Cobb, Secretary of the Treasury, they all supported the Confederacy during the Civil War. But in the 1850s, they were supportive of the Union. They were supportive of the Union, as many people who later supported the Confederacy were, so long as they could rule it, to use the words of another historian. And when their states seceded, when the Confederacy was created, they joined with the Confederacy, and for that matter did so. Went right from Buchanan's cabinet to supporting the Confederacy while he was still president.
I might add that this was really fortunate for the country. And you might say, well, why is these cabinet members leaving? Good. Well, think about it. Buchanan wasn't a strong figure in terms of responding to secession. He was going to look for what the legalisms were. That wasn't strong leadership. But when he had to replace these people, he replaced them with people who were strong Unionists, including Joseph Holt from Kentucky, including then on to Oregon, born in Kentucky, from Oregon, and his closest political associate, Jeremiah Black, who had been his Attorney General, shifted over to Secretary of State and suggested that Buchanan then appoint his assistant, Edwin Stanton, to become Attorney General in his place. These three men, if you will, gave Buchanan his backbone during the secession crisis. At one point in December, and this is really one of the things that I learned most from this book, it looked as though Buchanan might just say very little to nothing about all of the goings-on in the southern states. And Black told him it would be a mark against him and it would be a disgrace if he didn't write a state paper that made it clear that secession was unacceptable. And Buchanan gave Black the opportunity to write something. Black wrote a very strong statement. Buchanan edited it, and it was one of the better state papers that Buchanan wrote during that crisis.
South Carolina seceded while James Buchanan was president. Why did they pick that time to secede?
Well, they seceded after Lincoln's election, but before his inauguration. The states of the Deep South seceded in large part because they were fearful of Lincoln as an anti-slavery president. And historians have discussed quite a bit as to why they would be so afraid of Lincoln, because Lincoln was a person who was supportive of slavery in the states where it existed, at least during the early years of his presidency and during his political career in the 1850s and before. Supportive of slavery where it existed, but after 1854, Lincoln was determined to keep slavery out of the federal territories located in the West. And so while Lincoln was quite clear on that position, Southern people living in the southern states, whites living in the southern states, were fearful, I think, of two things. One was a recognition that they could no longer rule the Union. They could no longer ensure that a pro-slavery politician would be president. Someone like James Buchanan or Franklin Pierce, or even Millard Fillmore, people who might have been from the North, but who would have been supportive, broadly speaking, of Southern policy. But the other thing they feared with respect to Lincoln was the executive appointed powers, and that Lincoln would be appointing people to serve as customs collectors and postmasters who would be loyal Republicans and who would then build up the Republican Party in the South among non-slaveholding whites.
Circulate pamphlets and broadsides attacking slavery, getting them into the hands of people the pro-slavery faction didn't want them to get into.
When Buchanan was elected, 1856, took office in 1857, what did he want to accomplish?
He had two main things he wanted to accomplish, and he stated them fairly directly. The first one, which was public, was that he wanted to quell agitation over the slavery issue as much as possible, and to keep the country at peace and to keep the country, if you will, satisfied as one country. That was important to him.
Northern agitation he wanted to quell?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
He interpreted agitation largely as being something that was Northern fueled.
And abolitionist inspired. Yeah. And the second thing he wanted to do, maybe he wasn't quite as direct about this, but he was certainly clear about it enough in his correspondence, was he wanted to keep the Democratic Party as the dominant party in the country. Now, that was partly because he was a loyal Democrat, had been an Andrew Jackson man going way back. Part of it was that he believed that the Democratic Party was the only instrument for a united country and for a prosperous country. He didn't think much of the opposition, and he certainly didn't like the Republicans. He called them black Republicans, and I think those were his two fundamental goals, and he seems to have failed dismally on both.
He, as one of our essays points out, the one by Paul Finkelman, Buchanan knew in advance what the Dred Scott decision was going to be, knew how the court was going to decide, and then announced during his inaugural address that he urged Americans to give support to a decision that would be forthcoming from the Supreme Court in a matter of days. And Buchanan knew what that decision was. And Buchanan, throughout his presidency, was supportive of the Dred Scott decision. But the part of the Dred Scott decision that Buchanan was most supportive of was the idea that the federal the people living within territories should have slavery protected there. That slavery would be protected within territories. That people had a right to take slaves into federal territories, and that at the moment of statehood, residents of a territory could decide for themselves whether they would want that prospective state to be slave or free. Buchanan held to this position throughout his presidency, and he hoped that he might be able to have Kansas come into the Union as a state, and he thought if he could get Kansas into the Union as a state, that would end the discord that was occurring within Kansas, and he also hoped that by ending the territorial issue, that it would put an end to the Republican Party. Put an end to the Republican Party would only strengthen the Democratic Party, and then he figured that the country would be able to continue on and of course ruled by Democrats. And his failure as a president was not only his inability to carry those things out, but also his inability to see that the plan he had worked out in his mind just wasn't going to work.
Well, if I might say so, Brian, one of the most intriguing things about Buchanan, in the context of what John has just said, is where there's a disconnect between Buchanan and the realities on the ground in the country, particularly in the North. It's possible that Buchanan was simply locked into a mindset that might have been valid in the 1840s, but that really was not applicable to the America of the 1850s and to the growing outrage in the North about this rule or ruin kind of notion among fire eaters. The growing moral component of the attack on slavery. The fact that more and more Northerners felt that the South really had too much power and that it needed to be diminished. He was in England from 1853 to 1855. He wasn't really on top of public opinion. He was so sure of himself, Brian. He always was convinced that he knew best, that I don't think he studied evidence very, very well. He may have only been listening to one side of the story, and again, from his Southern advisors. So I think this plays into the comments that John's making.
And this is something that Buchanan exhibits throughout his career. He's convinced, after the Kansas policy has proven to be a complete disaster, he continues to be not only convinced that his plan was right, he says so in his annual message of December 1858. After the country is in the midst of war, Buchanan continues to be convinced, after he has left the White House, that he had done the right thing, and in essence says as much in his memoirs that he writes during the war but are published after the war.
Jean Baker, who has written a book about James Buchanan, was on this program for it, wrote a chapter in your book, and she says he was the most dangerous of chief executives, a stubborn, mistaken ideologue whose principles held no room for compromise. We'll let that stand. How did he know what the decision was going to be in the Dred Scott case?
Well, he had a friend and several associates who he could communicate with. One of the interesting Pennsylvania angles here, Brian, is that two members of the Supreme Court were Dickinson College graduates. One of them a Pennsylvanian named Robert Greer, the other a Marylander named Roger Brooke Tawney. And he had communications with them as well as with Justice John Catron of Tennessee. And in each case, I think, in retrospect, and certainly our contributor Paul Finkelman makes this argument, he stepped way over some invisible ethical line by not only inquiring as to what they were going to do, but actually encouraging them to go in a certain direction. And I think most of us would say that that was not a good thing. Now, we have other examples in history of presidents interfering with the Supreme Court. Probably the most obvious one is Lyndon Johnson's communications with Abe Fortas, but I'm sure that Franklin Roosevelt had his communications with members of the court as well. But what Buchanan did here, his goal may have been laudable, which was maybe we can get this whole issue behind us if the court rules. That was actually very unrealistic. But what he did ethically, I think, was not acceptable.
John, you referred to Kansas, and in the book, it says biographer Gene Baker has called Buchanan's Kansas policy one of the greatest of presidential blunders in American history. What was the situation in Kansas? What was Buchanan's blunder?
Well, it's a complicated story. But in 1854, Congress passes a bill, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which organizes the vast territory that's west of Missouri, or west of Missouri and Iowa and east of the Rocky Mountains. The Kansas-Nebraska territory organizes into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and does so on the basis of popular sovereignty. That is, allowing the white residents of those territories to decide whether they would, whether slavery would be permitted within that territory or not. During the final 2 years of the Pierce administration, large numbers of settlers went into Kansas from the north and from the south with an eye towards getting cheap land, place to farm. But the result was a lot of fighting as to Kansas's political future. Should Kansas be a territory that would legalize slavery or not?
Literal fighting.
Literal fighting. In the Kansas War, there's probably 200 or so people who were killed in a place with a population of between 10 and 20,000, and so it's pretty serious stuff. Well, when Buchanan becomes president, one of his objectives is to end the Kansas troubles by having Kansas be admitted into the Union as a state. Buchanan's view was that if Kansas comes in as a state, whether it comes in as a slave state or whether it comes in as a free state, the problem of Kansas will be solved. But as it happens, the politics in Kansas were fraud-ridden. Large numbers of people from 1854, in the first Kansas election to choose a territorial delegate to Congress, large numbers of residents from Missouri would come into Kansas, vote, and then go back to Missouri, and they would vote in favor of a candidate and later candidates who would be favorable towards slavery. So eventually, settlers from the north, the free state settlers, boycotted those elections altogether because they said the whole system is corrupt. Well, eventually, those slave state settlers organize a territorial government in Lecompton, and eventually they put together a constitutional convention that applies for admission as a state. The problem is that the slave state settlers constitute a minority of the settlers in Kansas, and this is something that everybody knows. At the same time, those slave state settlers essentially are the ones who have won the elections that were legally held. And Buchanan, being the legalist, says, in effect, that the Lecompton Constitution was one that had gone forth through the legitimate mechanisms of choosing a prospective state constitution.
Let me interrupt here and say simply that I can put this very quickly, that Buchanan's legalism trumped any sense of justice and fair play, if you just abstract what John is saying. And hence, he aroused public opinion in the North against the doings in Kansas because it was so clearly rigged and so clearly fraud-ridden. And that's how you get this tremendous rift, the famous rift between Stephen A. Douglas from Illinois and Buchanan, which essentially splits the Democratic Party down the middle and ensures, or close to ensures, that the Republican Party will win in 1860.
Yeah. And that's a fight that Buchanan, in essence, made worse. By his holding, as Michael said, to this strict legalism of having a prospective state constitution be sent to Congress that's clearly fraudulent. It has strong support of Southern members of Congress and weak support among Northern Democrats, many of whom don't want to support it. They're with Stephen Douglas, also a Democrat who holds this idea of popular sovereignty, and Douglas's view of popular sovereignty is that you have to have a clean and fair election in Kansas in order for popular sovereignty to work. And Buchanan never was a fan of popular sovereignty. He just wanted Kansas to become a state. And then he figured that once Kansas was a state, that the problems would then fix themselves.
How did it turn out?
Badly. Yeah. Not only did Kansas not get admitted to the Union, because in the end Buchanan, with all the arm twisting and all the patronage, and some would say all the money that flowed into the hands of certain congressmen, he couldn't get it through. In addition to that, in 1858, as kind of a backlash, the Democratic Party suffered a pretty severe defeat in the midterm elections. So Buchanan didn't help himself politically at all.
And he made his party more Southern-based within Congress by weakening it so much within the North after the 1858 elections.
You mentioned a couple different people that he had interaction with. Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was a senator at the time?
Yeah.
Stephen Douglas, of course, who was known as the Little Giant, is most famous for being the adversary of Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and then for running that very courageous but futile race for president in 1860 when the Democratic Party split. Douglas was a very fine orator, a tough politician, tough legislator, effective. He was the guy more than any single person, Brian, who was responsible for making the Compromise of 1850 happen, which solved an earlier kerfuffle between the North and the South. Douglas wanted to be president, and he had run. He was probably Buchanan's main alternative in 1856, and he lost. And here's the thing, about Douglas. Douglas campaigned. Once he lost the nomination, he campaigned hard for Buchanan. He went around the country speaking for Buchanan against the Republican Party. And yet, when Buchanan becomes president, he does everything he can to undercut Douglas by giving patronage to Douglas's enemies, by saying nasty things about Douglas, and in effect, writing him out of the Democratic Party.
And writing him a thank you note to Samuel A. Douglas.
Which I've never understood, which I have never understood.
Right. Yeah.
How did Buchanan ever defeat Stephen Douglas for the Democratic nomination?
He was, to use the lingo of the 1800s, he was the most available candidate. And what that translates into is Democrats viewed him as the most electable candidate. He had the best resume. He was not caught up, as Douglas was, in the controversy over the Kansas-Nebraska bill, which John alluded to a few minutes ago. Douglas gained adherence for what he had done in Kansas and Nebraska, but he'd also made enemies. Buchanan had fewer enemies in 1856 than any other potential candidate. He had the experience. People didn't necessarily feel affection for Buchanan, but they respected him. And it got him the nomination.
And an irony in 1856 is that Stephen Douglas was one of the preferred candidates of the Southern delegates to the Democratic National Convention. And Buchanan was someone that Southern delegates felt comfortable with, but that Douglas's strength was among the Southern delegates. As it would happen within a few years, Douglas's base in the Democratic Party shifted north and he became anathema within the South. But in 1856, Douglas's strength was in the South. Buchanan, among Democrats at least, had a more of a national following than Douglas did.
You said a little bit earlier that this book is based on a conference that the two of you put together. And there are not a lot of books about James Buchanan, not a lot of historians have focused on him. What do you each find appealing in him that would make you want to write about him?
If you're going to use the word appealing, I think it's less that we find him personally attractive as a candidate or as a president than that he has been, I think, unduly neglected as president. I mean, we oscillate between scorn and vilification on one side and neglect on the other. If you ask the average professor of history what they know about Buchanan, they would be able to talk a little bit about Dred Scott, Kansas, and secession. And then Buchanan's presidency goes into a black hole. And what John and I thought we might do is to expand the reach of Buchanan's studies a bit. Now, I can't claim we expanded it as far as we would like it to go, but I think we did expand it. And I think the essay that you had us talk about earlier in this show on Utah is a great example of that. Who knew anything about what he'd done in Utah? And Bill McKinnon wrote this masterful piece, which I think will be part of the conversation for a good long time. So I think that the appealing part of it for John and me was that we could say some new things in new ways about Buchanan by bringing in really smart people who had expertise in this field.
John?
Well, I don't find Buchanan at all appealing, but he is
intriguing.
Yeah, but there's I think a fascination about anyone who can succeed in being elected president of the United States. There's a bit of skill and a bit of luck that's involved in it, and certainly Buchanan is a person who had some good political skills. He was elected to, as Michael said earlier, state legislature, U.S. House, U.S. Senate. He served as a Secretary of State, served as a minister or ambassador both to Russia and to Britain. And Polk even nominated him for the United States Supreme Court, which nomination he turned down, which also enables us to see that other side of Buchanan, and that is that some people really didn't care much for him, including James K. Polk. He wanted to kick him upstairs into the Supreme Court to get him out of his administration. So anyway, Buchanan is himself a fascinating person. And the politics of the 1850s are themselves, I think, of intrinsic fascination too. And Buchanan's very much a part of that politics.
When he was elected, did the Democratic Party control Congress?
Yes.
Yeah.
And did Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats think of themselves as being part of the same party?
Yes, absolutely. In 1856.
Yeah, although increasingly you have Northern Democrats who are more and more not with the program on the slavery issue. The slavery question begins to filter into almost every conversation. And so there are certain Northern Democrats who simply will not play ball with Southerners because they're defending their own turf and their own interests. And they're going to side, of course, with Douglas in the fights with Buchanan.
And those Northern Democrats have to respond by 1856 and thereafter to the growth of the Republican Party, which is running on a strongly anti-slavery, though not abolitionist platform. They want to take strong positions against slavery. They're not calling for national legislation to end slavery in the states where it exists because Republicans, by and large, didn't think that the federal government had that authority. So some Northern Democrats are, in 1856, a bit concerned about this matter. One of the things, though, that happens during Buchanan's presidency is that the Democratic Party, which had been one party in 1856, was two parties by the end of Buchanan's presidency, and it's probably two parties by 1858. And if we're to look at Buchanan's failure, I think in large part it's to look to the breaking up of the Democratic Party, as Roy Nichols called it, the disruption of democracy, of the Democratic Party. And Buchanan's very much in the midst of all that.
How was the economy during his term?
Not good. In fact, that's where the luck point that John offers is very relevant. The economy was robust in the 1850s, and of course we had this tremendous boom in railroad building and economic development related to railroads, but we had something called the Panic of 1857. And what's interesting about the Buchanan connection here is, of course, no president in and of himself is usually responsible for an economic downturn of this magnitude. But Buchanan, because of his, quote, strict construction views, was completely opposed to any of the pump priming measures that the Republican Party favored. And as a result, rivers and harbors bills, for example, to help build our infrastructure, the equivalent of what we would say today if we were talking about highway reconstruction or fast rail. Buchanan vetoed everything that came down the pike from Congress in this regard. And that may have satisfied Southern Democrats who didn't like the idea of the federal government spending money on things because they didn't like the federal government having much power over anything. But it certainly aggravated not just Republicans, but also Northern Democrats who wanted these projects for their districts.
He also had a plan to annex Cuba. Something. I mean, other things happened in his administration that didn't have to do with the Civil War.
It was his
if he had any fixed idea in politics aside from strict construction, it was probably annexing Cuba. He'd been talking about this for years and years.
He was an expansionist, as many pre-Civil War Democrats were. Northern Democrats, many of them favored expansion for expansionist sake. Many Southern Democrats do, with an eye, though, also towards expanding the area where slavery would be legal. And so there were a lot of Southern Democrats who favored the annexation of Cuba because they liked the idea of bringing Cuba into the Union, making it a slave state, and expanding the area where slavery would be legal.
Who controlled Cuba at the time?
It was a Spanish colony.
And Buchanan made numerous overtures to Spain, dangling money in front of Spain for Cuba, and at the time they were not interested.
He made an effort to secure Cuba from Spain when he was the United States minister or ambassador to Britain. And then, as putting money aside during his presidency, as the essay by John Bell Lovick mentions, to purchase Cuba from Spain. Spain made it clear that Cuba was not for sale. Spain had an enormous empire in the Western Hemisphere, and in the 1850s, Cuba was really all that they had left, and they were determined to keep it.
Spain no longer controlled Central and South America?
No, those areas had become independent in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars.
One of your essays says that as far as Buchanan, his wider goals were wedded to an older, more nationalistic vision of manifest destiny and mission. He held a lonely vigil pursuing ideas whose time had come and gone. Mm-hmm. Was he like that in other things, where he held on to ideas whose time had come and gone?
Yeah, we have a number of our contributors do make that point, that Buchanan's mind was kind of wedded to the politics of the 1830s and of the 1840s. As Michael Morrison said, Buchanan never really came to realize that the territorial issue in the 1850s had as much vitality and just carried as much fervor as the Bank War did of the 1830s. And that's something that Buchanan never really understood.
And he could never again relate to the moral dimension of opposition to slavery. He didn't feel any great moral fervor on the issue. In the abstract, he would always say slavery is an evil, and it would be nice if we didn't have slavery. And indeed, one of the interesting things about your previous question and his interest in expanding to the South is that he had this notion that somehow by expanding into Mexico or expanding into Cuba, that you would actually be benefiting the overall health of the country's economy and the overall health of the country, and the slavery issue was just not even part of the storyline. And I think that in that sense, he really was playing out of a playbook that was too old.
One of the authors refers to him as being morally tone deaf on the slavery issue.
We'd buy that.
Yeah. He is, and he was. At the same time, as Michael mentioned, you can point to a number of things during Buchanan's career in which he didn't always side with the South with respect to slavery. He was a politician from Pennsylvania, and though personally he was not one who got very worked up about slavery. He recognized that some of his constituents did. So, for instance, when his sister married a man whose family was slaveholding, Buchanan undertook to, and this is in the 1830s, buy the slaves and ensure that they would be set on the path toward freedom. Not because he thought slavery was wrong, but because he knew that this was not something that was good for him politically.
On the downside of the ledger, I mean, as president, he's issuing state papers in which he's actually referring to slavery as mild and beneficent for the slaves. I don't think that comported too well with the reality.
Yeah.
Now, you talked about Wheatland, his home near Lancaster or in Lancaster. If somebody goes there, what do they see?
Well, they're going to see what it was like for him to live in that house. It's a beautifully preserved home. I believe that only about 4 of the original 17 acres surrounding the house are still there as they would have been in his day. I mean, he was growing things and so forth. And now they share the property with LancasterHistory.org, the former Lancaster County Historical Society. But I'll tell you, it's a wonderful house because you go into these homes and you see artifacts from Buchanan's time. You know, you've got the portrait of Queen Victoria in there, which was given to him. His study is something that John and I would die for, because he's got a lovely study with all his books and state papers in there, where he did much of the work when he was not in Washington. It's a nicely interpreted house. It's a place I encourage people to go.
Do the people there take a sympathetic view of him?
That's a good question. I would say, yes, sympathetic, but let's also say increasingly historically interesting and meritorious, which is to say they're interested in telling a true story about Buchanan. And I think this is a work in progress for Wheatland. I'm involved with some of what they're doing in terms of interpretation. I'm very pleased by the sheer integrity of what I hear coming out of the folks who run Wheatland. They want to get it right, and they don't want to say that Buchanan was just always misunderstood and he was always the right guy. I think they want to tell the story sympathetically, but also fairly.
Could anybody else who held the office of president in that era have done anything differently to avoid the Civil War, or was it Civil War inevitable?
Well, I don't know that the Civil War was inevitable until the Civil War began, and once the Civil War began, it wasn't inevitable that it would last 4 years until the war itself was over. There were a lot of challenges that for anyone to have faced. I think that Buchanan may have made a bad situation worse. I don't know if things would have turned out differently if someone else had been president, but in terms of the sheer politics of Buchanan's being president, the way to keep the Civil War from happening would have been to have kept the National Democratic Party intact. And if the National Democratic Party had remained intact, there's a good chance the Democrats might have won in 1860 if they had continued as a national party rather than running 2 candidates. To be sure, Lincoln won a majority of the electoral votes. He also won a majority of the votes across the North. But if you look at those states where Lincoln won electoral votes, but he also won with 51% or less, it's easy to see how the scenario in 1860 might have turned out different if Buchanan could have succeeded in keeping the National Democratic Party intact. Not to mention the electoral votes that the Democrats lost in the South to John Bell, the Constitutional Union candidate, who won all of his electoral votes in states with 48% of the vote or less.
But here's the thing. And I agree with John's analysis, but the thing that is difficult to wrap your arms around is, what if Buchanan had been less maladroit and less stubborn and taken some different courses? For example, what if he had rejected what was clearly a fraudulent effort to bring the state of Kansas into the Union as a slave state? What if he'd rejected that? Well, then his Southern friends would have rejected him on a dime, and the Democratic Party still would have divided.
Yeah.
It would have taken a president with a lot more skill than anybody who was then on the scene had, I think, to keep the country moving together in a unified direction.
Yeah, good point. If not Buchanan, who?
Who?
Buchanan looked like a good candidate in 1856 because he was so well experienced. He had held all these offices, but none of them had been offices that had required him to exercise any kind of executive or managerial authority. I mean, at the same time, if Stephen Douglas, say, had become the president in 1857 instead of Buchanan, if he had secured the nomination, I really don't know how things would have turned out, but his managerial experience is not such we really could have said that he would have been a better manager than Buchanan. Same time, Lincoln had even less managerial experience than either of those candidates, and he rose to the occasion. So it's hard to know who could have done it better than Buchanan, but the Democratic Party was weaker at the end of his administration than it was at the beginning of his administration, and having presided over that breakup of the Democratic Party, he does have to, I think, shoulder some responsibility for it.
If the Democratic Party had stayed together, would it just have been staving off the inevitable? I mean, were the two sections drifting inexorably apart?
I think that they were. I think that cotton was so strong as an economic force in the country that Southerners, particularly powerful Southerners, were not about to give up the mechanism for getting that cotton to market and planting it and harvesting it and all the rest, and that meant slavery. I'm more of the structural, interpretation, which I don't think it's just blundering politicians that got us a civil war, Brian. I think it's clearly a combination of both. One of the comments in the panel discussion that John moderated says that in response to this kind of a question, says that the Civil War probably was inevitable, but it was certainly helped along by blundering politicians, and that's more or less where I'd come down.
If at the same time, the states of the Deep South were, I believe, worried in 1860 and 1861 by trends that they saw occurring in the states of the Upper South. In Delaware, which was only a slave state in name, Maryland almost becoming just a slave state in name, concerns that Kentucky and Missouri were not going to be forever wedded to slavery, and perhaps Virginia as well. It's hard to know what would have happened if the Civil War did not begin in 1861, and if what would have happened further on down the road. But at the same time, looking at 1860, 1861, if there hadn't been the breakup of the Democratic Party, it would have perhaps postponed it. But I guess we'll never know.
Did Buchanan ever talk about running for a second term?
He actually said right off the bat on being inaugurated he wasn't going to run for a second term. So his goal was to, as John said, hold the Democratic Party together. He failed at that. He never really. I mean, he was one of our oldest presidents, and born in 1791. So when he takes office, he's already 65 years of age. He had come into office with National Hotels disease, which he had gotten through bad water in the Capitol, in the Willard Hotel. And so he actually left the White House in somewhat better physical condition than he came in.
National Hotels disease?
Yeah, it's, what would you call it, John?
Bad food, bad water. Yeah.
I mean,
gastrointestinal
problems. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And so,
now at the same time, there is some evidence indicating that Buchanan wanted to be asked to run again. Whether he would have run is another matter, but there are some indicators that he would have wanted to at least have been asked. Even though he said in his inaugural address he was only going to serve one term, there's some evidence that in 1860 that he would have liked to have.
But it was the
been
equivalent
asked.
of Woodrow Wilson wanting to have run in 1920 when he was a broken man. Buchanan was tired. His toolbox of interesting ideas had been exhausted. He wasn't prepared to serve another term, even if he could have gotten the nomination.
Did Buchanan have any kind of interaction with Abraham Lincoln?
He sure did. Not much, and not much that mattered to Lincoln. But he did stop. At one point, he stopped in the White House when Lincoln was president and asked for a book back that he had, and then he got the book back. I think that the important thing to remember about Buchanan and Lincoln, and it's not well known, is the degree to which Buchanan, on the level of the Union, was sympathetic to Lincoln. Was sympathetic to Lincoln during the secession crisis, was sympathetic to Lincoln's calling out the troops after Fort Sumter, was sympathetic to Lincoln's not willing to negotiate with the South over just come back in and we'll all be friends. Where he parted company with Lincoln was on the Emancipation Proclamation and arming black troops. Buchanan was very conservative on those issues. But he was consistently a war Democrat. And in that sense, and he also, let me just add, when Lincoln was assassinated, he was deeply grieved.
The perhaps the most famous exchange, and the only one that we have aside from this correspondence, where Buchanan's writing to Lincoln asking about these books, is when they rode in a carriage from the White House to the Capitol when Lincoln was going to be taking his inaugural. And on that occasion, Buchanan revealed on more than one occasion that he said to Lincoln, if you're as happy to be taking this office as I am to be leaving it, Buchanan said, you must be a very happy man.
How did he spend his post-White House years?
Well, he spent them mostly at Wheatland. He was engaged in what you would call domestic affairs. He was doing his business, watching his investments, loaning money to people. Early on, he thought he was going to spend more time as a man about town. The first month or two that he's home, he's going to the tavern and hanging out with friends. Unfortunately, once Sumter happened and the Civil War began, he really wasn't being greeted very friendly, and he decided to stay closer to home. He was a person who liked entertaining very much. He would entertain former associates in politics. He entertained his niece, Harriet Lane, who had been essentially the First Lady during his years in the White House. He entertained many nieces and nephews and friends of nieces and nephews. He needed to have company in his house. And those years that he was in retirement were happiest for him when Wheatland was filled with people. He loved Christmas, for example.
How did he view his presidency late in life?
He had no regrets, and made it clear he had no regrets. He was not a person who seemed to have spent a lot of time worrying about things that had gone wrong. He had no regrets.
But at the same time, he was very ardent in vindicating himself. Not only did he use the word, I am vindicated by events many times in correspondence, but he spent a chunk of the war assembling documents and putting together a third-person memoir written in the third person, justifying everything he had ever done, as particularly so relating to secession. And as John suggests, if he ever had any reflection or self-criticism, we haven't found it.
He saw himself as a person steering between extremists of the North and extremists of the South, in which the extremists of the North were more to blame. That is the abolitionists. He, in his message to Congress in December of 1860, as the secession crisis is underway, he blames the problems that the country is facing at the time on the abolitionists, and does so in his memoir as well.
There's in the introduction, I believe it is, which one of you two wrote, it says his administration organ in the nation's capital, the Washington Constitution, printed editorials supporting secession. Gene Baker refers to Buchanan's final months in office as a collaboration with the South, observing that his favoritism toward the South bordered on disloyalty.
Yeah, she does say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think that there's a strong argument to be made that he was anything other than a determined unionist, and that he was going to do whatever he could up to the point of provoking a war. He was going to do whatever he could to maintain the federal authority where our installations were in the South, being, for example, Fort Sumter.
And in November and December of 1860, Buchanan was of a mind that the way to preserve the Union was to cave in and give secessionists much of what they wanted as a way of kind of ending the secessionist crisis. And this underwent a change when Lewis Cass resigned from his cabinet as Secretary of State in early December of 1860, in essence saying that Buchanan was caving in way too much. And as Michael said earlier, the latter 2 months of Buchanan's administration was much more of a unionist one.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. We've been speaking with John Quist and Michael Birkner. They are the editors of this book, James Buchanan and the Coming of the Civil War. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.